The second Diablo beta has passed, and I spent approximately 20 hours playing Necromancer and testing various builds. I'm a little late to the game, and I'll try to keep this video as condensed as possible, but I wanted to provide some feedback on a few aspects of Necromancer, such as the leveling experience, skills and talents, some legendary powers and how they felt, and finally some different builds that I played and how those felt to play. And just as a quick reminder, if you find this video helpful in any way or want to see more Diablo 4 content in the future, make sure you hit that subscribe button to stay notified for more Diablo 4 content coming soon. Starting off, let's get into the leveling experience. The Necromancer feels like it's online and functional from level 1. Most classes don't feel like they truly start to come online until around level 15, and while it's also true that the Necromancer could have access to some of those additional skills, the class just never really felt like it was truly missing that core skill, except for maybe Corpse Explosion. Your army of skeletons are capable of tanking a lot of hits for you while dishing out constant damage. With how easy it was to maintain your army, the Necromancer never really felt like it falls off. Once you reach level 15, things get even easier as you get your expanded army by summoning mages, which dish out some crazy single target damage, and it really ramps up your boss and elite damage. In addition, once you do unlock Corpse Explosion, you just have constant burst AoE options that really help speed up that mob and dungeon clearing speed, fully enabling the Necromancer class. In this next section, I want to talk about a few of the outlier skills and talents, and I'm not going to go into every single one of those because that would just take way too much time. So I'm just going to try to give a brief summary of each of the different clusters and kind of how they felt. Starting out in our basic attacks, Bone Splinters is a fantastically powerful ability. This basic attack fires projectiles in a shotgun manner where managing to hit a single enemy with all projectiles will deal a ton of damage. This skill can also easily apply vulnerability too, since each projectile fired has a 20% chance of applying the debuff to enemies if you take that enhancement. Overall, it just felt like a very powerful skill that enables a lot of builds, not just bone builds. The remaining 4 basic attacks all felt decent and like they had a place in other builds, but like I said, Bone Splinters just felt like it was a step above the rest. Moving into the core cluster, the 2 skills that I had issues with were Bloodlance and Sever. Bloodlance felt like it required a lot of work to really get going and maintain in AoE situations. I believe there are a few legendaries that enhance Bloodlance, but the one that I played with was the one that has a chance to fire an additional lance, which is supposed to increase that cleave ramp up time. It still felt kind of bad in AoE situations, even when using that legendary. It just sort of felt like a scenario of why spend all this time in AoE spreading Bloodlance when I can just use 1 or 2 Blood Surges with no thought and clear a room. As for Sever, this skill felt fine damage wise, but it just kind of felt clunky to use. I'm not entirely sure what it was. I think I just sort of expected the attack to have a little bit longer of a reach than it actually does. So this could have just totally been user error essentially, and maybe I just needed to play around with it a little bit more to get a better feel. But yeah, the animation and range just initially felt weird. Next, we're going to move into the Macabre cluster, and here we have Corpse Explosion, Blood Mist, and Bone Prison. Very quickly, Corpse Explosion felt great to use. Both variations of the skill felt good to run, and the different synergies that come from some of those passives felt pretty good. Now, I want to talk about Bone Prison a little bit because I feel like this skill has a bit of an identity crisis. Without any legendary effects, Bone Prison functions purely as a utility skill to generate essence, trap enemies, and either apply vulnerability or provide you with some extra tankiness by fortification. I tried fitting Bone Prison into multiple builds, but it always just kind of felt like there were better options. I think the legendary effect, which causes the bones to deal damage whenever they die or expire, could make this skill a little more appealing if that was made baseline. I think that would kind of help set Bone Prison up as a little bit more of an appealing damage option, because yeah, right now it just feels like it's not really used for damage. It's kind of got decent utility, but there are other sources of applying vulnerability. It's just, I'm not entirely sure when you would want to run Bone Prison. Blood Mist, on the other hand, feels like it can either be one of the most powerful or just a pretty solid skill depending on your legendaries. I'm sure many people already know what legendary I'm referring to, but we'll talk about this a little bit later. But as far as the base skill of Blood Mist goes, with just your core enhancements, being able to generate corpses passively while also going invulnerable and healing a bit is some nice utility. Even though you can't attack during Blood Mist, your minions are still providing consistent DPS, meaning that this skill doesn't make you lose out on that much damage. The next set of skills are our curses, and truthfully, both curses felt very strong for different reasons. Iron Maiden Maiden was a good source of burst essence generation while of course applying that return damage effect. Decrepify was extremely powerful in how it slows and reduces enemy damage done. That being said, I didn't really like to use either curse because of, I guess, a lack of feedback and no visual indicator as to who was actually cursed. More accurately, the curses probably do have a visual indicator, but I didn't really notice it because I'm probably oblivious, but that's kind of my point. In addition, all of the final enhancements for both curses seemed kind of bad. I think the only one that really felt good to take in some situations was the Iron Maiden's heal effect, which is whenever an enemy dies while cursed with Iron Maiden, they would heal you for a little bit. But even then, it didn't really feel necessary since Necromancer felt like it never actually took damage with all your minions tanking for you. Next up, we have the summoning cluster with Corpse Tendrils and Bone Spirit. First, I want to say I was really excited to play with Bone Spirit, and I think there are some really cool builds with this skill. That being said, I didn't get to play around with it too much, unfortunately, but when I was leveling up with it, it was dealing some pretty chunky damage, which felt nice. I really like that there's this build option for a kind of builder-spender playstyle, where the spender actually has some major payoff with its damage done. Corpse Tendril I didn't really like using because of the delay before enemies actually got pulled in. It just made the skill feel a little clunky and like I had to pause what I was doing before I really started doing big damage. The thing with this cluster though is there are some really strong passive talents. For example, Serration is insanely strong if you're playing a bone build. Gaining 1.5% crit chance for every 10 essence you have is a lot of critical strike chance for just 3 talent points. Another talent I think is pretty cool and could be strong is Coalesce Blood, which increases the damage of your blood skills while healthy. My only problem with this though is it didn't really feel like blood skills have a big massive payoff skill outside of Blood Surge overpowers. And finally, we have our ultimate cluster, and truthfully, all of the ultimates felt pretty bad to use. The cooldowns for the power that they provided didn't quite feel like it was there, even with the legendary that buffed Blood Wave and Bone Storm to cause them to deal bonus shadow damage over time felt kind of bad to use. Just to be clear, those skills were doing a lot of burst damage, but it felt bad having to wait for nearly a minute before being able to do that again in an ARPG. And now very quickly, I just wanted to go over the Book of the Dead and how each of those soldiers felt to use. It's important to note that since this was an endgame, skeletons were easy to keep alive, and that might have some influence on this early feedback. Of all of these skeletal warriors, Reapers felt like they provided the most value because of their ability to generate corpses. This played especially well with the Blood Mist legendary, which we'll cover in a moment. And as for skeletal defenders, they didn't really seem like they provided much value since, like I said, skeletons were easy to keep alive, and things never really felt like they were really in danger. As for the skeletal skirmishers, they felt fine. Having the ability to summon an additional skirmisher meant that if you were playing a pet-based build, you had an extra source of damage, which was good. As for the mages, all of them felt pretty good to use and like they had places in different builds. The most difficult to play with would be the skeletal mages since they consume their own life in order to attack. However, being able to take a talent for the skeleton mages, which causes them to drop a corpse whenever they kill themselves, means that they're kind of self-sustaining and that you can use those corpses that they drop to just resummon different mages. As for the golems, we only had the chance to play with the bone golem due to level restrictions, but the builds where you could actually fit a golem in, they felt like they were pretty decent tanks. The issue is that golems have a separate summon button, and most of the time it was difficult to fit that extra skill button on your bars, which usually meant that you were going to be sacrificing your golem for extra stats. Legendary powers are what make builds feel truly interactive and fun. Some of these powers we experienced in the betas were already pretty ridiculous, and Blizzard has already mentioned there will be more when the game goes live. So in this section, I want to talk about some of the most standout legendaries and if they will be nerfed or possible changes that might make them feel better. The first legendary here is probably the one most people played with, and that's Aspect of Explosive Mist. This legendary makes it so that anytime you walk over a corpse while channeling Blood Mist, you automatically trigger a corpse explosion. Furthermore, detonating a corpse reduces the cooldown of Blood Mist. This results in some ridiculous gameplay where you're generating a bunch of corpses, exploding them all with Blood Mist, and then repeating since Blood Mist cooldown is reduced. This one legendary is so much fun to use, it sounds great, but oh my god is it so stupidly broken, and I expect it to get nerfed or reworked slightly before launch. The reason it felt so strong to use is because you obviously are allowed to live within Blood Mist, which is going to make you invulnerable while also dealing some solid burst AoE damage. Secondly, this legendary also synergizes very well with a couple passive legendary effects that synergize off of consuming corpses, allowing you to instantly regenerate resources and buff up your damage for little risk. This one legendary with the correct talent setup is essentially a full complete build, it feels like. I think if anything needed to be nerfed on this legendary, it should be the cooldown reduction of the skill. I think it's fine to have cooldown reduction attached to the effect, but the range at which the cooldown reduction can roll needs to be a little more narrow, I think. For example, in my playthrough, I think I rolled high and I got it so that Blood Mist cooldown would be reduced by 1.4 seconds for each corpse consumed, and this basically made it so that Blood Mist had no cooldown. I have heard from others stating that having the cooldown reduced by only 0.5 seconds felt like it was pretty good, and that Blood Mist was up often enough, but not as abusable. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that there is a fine range, I think, for the cooldown reduction, but let's just not make it too ridiculous. One change that might make for a fair trade-off is when using this legendary, Blood Mist no longer makes you invulnerable. This seems like it would be a nice trade-off for removing defensive power for offensive power. And just one final note about this legendary is there is kind of a tax to using it, I suppose. Because Blood Mist normally it slows your move speed, there is another legendary out there that actually removes that move speed penalty on Blood Mist, and it also applies a damage over time effect to enemies hit with Blood Mist. And because this is considered a offensive legendary, it's kind of weak in that sense, so you're kind of offsetting a very strong legendary by using a very poor legendary to kind of remove that Blood Mist penalty, that move speed penalty. So I don't know if that actually offsets the overpoweredness of Explosive Mist though. Another legendary that felt quite strong was the legendary that increased your shadow damage to enemies afflicted by both curses. This legendary felt very boring to play, if I'm being honest, due to the lack of feedback when pressing your curse skills, but the damage was quite good. My damage over time effects were hitting insanely hard with this build, and I never felt like I was in any danger thanks to Decrepify's damage reduction. This build type also comboed pretty well with the Decompose legendary that causes Decompose to chain to additional enemies. Finally, one legendary I tried to make work was the aspect of Ultimate Shadow, which converts Blood Wave and Bone Storm into shadow skills with added damage over time effects. The damage over time effects on these skills did feel pretty powerful, but I just felt like I couldn't justify taking the ultimates due to wanting those skill slots for something else. The fact that these ultimate skills have nearly a minute cooldown is just not appealing. If there was another legendary out there that reduced the cooldown of your ultimate abilities, then maybe this would be a solid option. And in fact, there might already be that legendary. I just didn't get it in the beta and I didn't really see one out there. But if that's not the case, maybe adding a legendary with that effect or adding some sort of cooldown reduction to this legendary could make ultimate skills a little bit more appealing. In this final section, I want to quickly summarize a few builds I played and how they felt. In one of my previous videos, I talked about a few build concepts to try in this beta, and in fact I spent a lot of my time in this beta trying out 2 different variations of builds suggested in that video. The build types that I primarily focused on in this beta were shadow damage builds, army builds, and a juggernaut build. For the shadow damage build, this primarily focused on a lot of damage over time effects. This is where you would want to run the double curse legendary to increase your shadow damage and also sacrifice skeletal reapers for additional shadow damage. You would then take Decompose, Blight, and the damage over time effect on Corpse Explosion. With all of those combined, you and your shadow mages would pump out damage, and in fact, this was the fastest single target boss damage build that I tested. Like I said though, playing with double curses doesn't really feel that great to play with, so this build, while it has its moments and felt strong, it got boring to play pretty quickly. The second build was one that focused entirely on the army of skeletons, and in this build I took legendaries which increased my army count for mages and skeletal warriors, and also I took passives to buff minion damage. This build couldn't quite fully be realized in the beta, and I guess no build essentially can, but you were just short investing a couple skill points into the ultimate talent cluster to increase minion damage and attack speed. I think if you got those, this build would have really started to pop off, but like I said, you're short like 2 skill points. That being said, even without some of those deep tree talents, this build was still very strong when I tested it. However, I will say that the build kind of got a little boring because with any kind of pet build, your damage is almost entirely coming from the pets themselves, so you're essentially just maintaining the skeleton priest damage buff, but outside of that, there's not really any nuance to the build, which eventually led it to getting boring pretty quick. The final build is the one that I had the most fun with in all of the betas that I played, and it's what I spent most of my time playing, and that was a Blood Juggernaut Necromancer. Initially, I had planned on playing this build by fully sacrificing the Army of the Dead. However, after getting some Legendaries and realizing how resource hungry this build actually was, I decided to run with the Skeletal Reapers. This allowed the Reapers to generate corpses for me to consume, and there's a passive talent that recovers essence whenever you consume a corpse. In addition, there's a legendary effect that has a chance to generate blood orbs whenever you consume a corpse. And then there's also another legendary that whenever you consume a blood orb at full health, you generate essence, which essentially led you to having a ton of essence, and you could just spam blood surges and stay healthy all the time. It was just so tanky, and you just did not give a crap about any damage, and it was just so much fun. I can't explain it. But I want to hear what you guys thought about the Necromancer. Were there any complaints that you had with the class? I think I'm pretty happy with the class overall, and I'm very interested to see what other legendaries we will see on live release of the game, because I know at least a handful of them that have been data mined could really spice up a few builds. But that's it for me. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.